Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is S.B. Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Virgo Moon as the luminary out of Sect, I speak with the artist, diviner, writer, and educator, J.M. Hamade. In addition to discussing the Virgo Moon in Jay's third whole sign house in this conversation, we also touch on the Lunar Mansions or Nakshatras. As Jay is a student of both the Vedic and Arabic traditions, we compare and contrast these two systems quite a bit. We also talk about the nature of the third house and the moon's joy there, as well as the relationship of Mercury and the moon, as well as Virgo and ideas of virginity and parthenogenesis. Before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to give y'all a little life update, especially as it relates to this podcast. I am moving back to New York and will be driving across the country from LA the last week in September. That will coincide with the beginning of Libra season, so the first Libra Moon episode will be uploaded a little later than I usually would. Just wanted to let y'all know. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and timing consultations as well as answering query questions. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I appreciate you. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, J.M. Hamade, thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure to have you. Yeah, to start off the conversation, how has the recent astro weather been for you? For listeners, it's August 12th, 5:15 New York time. We are about to have the Venus Cazimi tomorrow. Mercury's in shadow. Things are going on. How's it been?
Been a mixed bag. Venus retrograde in my second house, second lord in the 10th. So all kinds like what am I doing with my life and sources of income, and the second house just being structures, resources, all these things in our life. So as one would expect, and I am an artist. I'm in grad school for art right now. I'm a
Cool.
FA kid at the moment, and so all these things around pricing work. What is your aesthetic work valued? How would you value your aesthetic work? These kinds of questions all popping up. The Venus retrograde has been a lot of that, as well as a lot of serpentine stuff. The part of Leo that the retrograde is happening in is happening along a lot of serpent star. So many things with snakes and various projects and interviews on my end of things having to do with snakes and stars. So I'd say those are the two big things.
Interesting. Is that Hydra, or are there other stars associated with serpents as well?
Hydra's the main one, and it's obviously a huge constellation. But the two lunar mansions, and I know we'll be talking a lot about lunar mansions, the two lunar mansions that Venus is retrograding over are Magha is the name of the nakshatra. It's often the 10th lunar mansion, and Ashlesha, which is also the name of the nakshatra, the 9th lunar mansion, which are the heart and then the head of Hydra, respectively. So there's the tail sort of keeps going. It's a big long river in the sky, but the heart star and the head star, which are often important in constellations anyways, are seeing a lot of prominence with this retrograde of Hydra. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. Cool, Jay. Thank you for sharing that. Can you now just give us a brief introduction to yourself and anything that kind of informs your identity as astrologer as well as your astrological practice?
Yeah, I do a lot of different things. I wear quite a few hats. I would say I'm an artist first and foremost, very interdisciplinary. It's really the thing that I've been doing the longest with my life in a variety of forms, visual art. I did music for a time, sound, sculpture, installation, performance. I've really tried everything. Not that everything has been successful. And I would say within the past 5 years or so, I've seen my art practice merge with what has been now about a decade of astrological study. I've been giving readings professionally, both astrologically as well as with cards and mediumship and things like that, for about the past 5 or 6 years now.
Oh, wow.
Around that same time frame that the art began merging with things having to do with stars and planets and whatnot. So the second appellation would be diviner. I honestly, I don't call myself an astrologer all that much. Sort of wrestle with the term because I do a lot of different things, and it's not really astrology TM in the way that I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with it, which I still use.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I still practice astrology in that very traditional manner, but it's not my main thing. So artist, diviner, I write. I'm not terribly great at it, but I write. I try to write. There's a few published things out. Illustration as well, which I guess would be included in the art. But yeah, diviner, writer. I teach classes sometimes, so put educator in there as well.
Wonderful.
Those are the big four.
Sounds like you have some important third house placements, which I know we're going to talk about today. And it's very interesting. A past guest was referring to my own third house placements as it relates to podcasting. And I know we've kind of talked a little bit about like Moon as podcaster, which feels particularly interesting for you because you have this podcast and you have your Moon in your third. And so that feels very kind of apropos.
Hoping to at some point have something with you related to that. It's definitely a thing, and I think it's I don't know, a trope that people have brought up before in relation to the moon. It's the similarity with the planet Mercury is there going back into ancient times. These quick planets and also these planets of speech, right? But the more intimate forms of speech, right, being the lunar kinds, even more intimate than the mercurial or even the Jupiterian kind of wisdom, speaking to the crowd thing that happens. And there's that intimate speech quality that I think gives podcasting that very lunar quality. The third house element, it's like, yeah, my moon is in the third house. So as I said, the Venus retrograde is happening in my second, makes me a Cancer rising. So that's its own thing in relation to the moon, having the moon as your first lord.
Right.
But I have weird feelings about the planetary joys schema, which maybe we'll talk about later. But
yeah, I hope so.
I do think there's something to the third house's skill, skills for sure, just general skill sets, and oftentimes skills that are in contrast to ninth house kinds of skills, like high, and I do high in scare quotes, religious structures and this kind of metaphysical thing. These are like on the ground skills, right?
Right.
The third house people are the kinds of people that if things went to shit and you needed to get by in the world, third house people are gonna sort of, have a bit of a leg up, right? They know how to do these tangible sorts of things. And though podcasting isn't necessarily a tangible thing, it's also like, that intimacy once again, right in the ear, speaking directly into the ear to the people. There's a kind of to the masses or populist quality to podcasting as well.
Yeah, I can't recall the story, but I'm reminded of the story I heard about the role of radio basically as like a revolutionary kind of tool to organize people within a certain area, and how kind of like independent radio can be this galvanizing force for that. And radio does feel like a very third house kind of thing, especially when it's focused on like a particular community or a local community. Agreed.
I guess we're talking about the third house, so I might as well just say it.
Yeah, let's get into it.
As far as I understand the house schema in Vedic astrology, the third house is, which is interesting that it's the moon's joy. in Western astrology, right? Because in Vedic astrology, the malefics are thought to do extremely well in the third house.
Extremely well at being malefic, or extremely well in terms of benefit for the native?
Or like a good example would be exalted Mars in Capricorn, right? Like it's a malefic that uses its malefic power towards constructive ends. Like it functions constructively there. It's not like eating away at the person. Like a debilitated malefic is more likely to do. It gives that person endurance. It gives that person, the ability to get through the harder aspects of life, which is what a strong malefic is good for, at least in my opinion. And so they're thought to do well in the third house because it's seen as it shares this with Western astrology, a place of siblings, right? And consequently, there's a competitive element to being in the place of siblings, as siblings often compete with one another. Peers compete with one another. So people who have third house things, there's this weird thing that I oftentimes notice in charts, clients and friends alike, of like, oftentimes the people that they're closest with are also people that they, whether they want to say it or not, are people that they sort of like compete with at some level. The nature of that competition can be more constructive. It can be more collaborative, right? That can exist. I'm not saying it's black and white by any means, but I think that, especially the moon, which is as a more simplistic way of putting it, a softer planet, it's interesting that its joy is in a place that's kind of like a rough and tumble environment, at least in Vedic astrology.
Yeah. And both of the luminaries are in joy in the tropical zodiac, in Caden houses, but the ninth gets this kind of, because of the trine to the ascendant, gets this kind of gets us looked at as a better house than the third, which I think maybe has to do with misogyny. I don't know. It's like,
I think that's a part of it, definitely.
Yeah, Venus and the sextile being of the nature of Venus, and Venus traditionally being associated with women, and the moon having maternal associations as well, joying in the third sextile to the ascendant. Yeah, so it is really interesting. But I think we'll get back to the third in a little bit, because I'm especially interested in hearing about you with having a Cancer rising, and the theme of Mundi having this Cancer rising, and so Virgo being the third in that kind of schema, and that kind of connection between the moon and Mercury that you spoke about a little bit. I think it's really interesting that Virgo falls on the third, and the third gets associated with the moon. So would love to kind of hear your thoughts about that in a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah, but to kind of get into the conversation about the moon a little bit more. Well, first off, I just want to give a shout out to our mutual friend, Sasha Ravich. She was kind enough to bring us together. And I was really excited about that you had a Virgo moon, because I kind of reached out and asked her if she knew anybody. She was like, yeah, Jay. And I was excited about that because I had attended your recent Desire panel with Sasha and a few other wonderful astrologers. And I was like, man, I really want to have Jay on the podcast. They're saying some really amazing things about this topic. And so grateful for them, grateful that I could have you on today. But to kind of get into it a little bit, was just curious, before you started studying astrology, before you were a diviner, although interested to see if this was showing up early on in your life as well. I'm curious to hear your relationship to the moon in your childhood, if there was one, or if you have one memory that kind of comes to mind in relation to the moon from that time.
Well, actually, I should give Sasha a shout out as well. Love you, Sasha. And thank you for, she's one of my biggest supporters, and she is actually, I say best friend, she is actually my best friend. That's not just like a thing we say. We go back. But yeah, I thought about the question, and there's a few memories. The first one, so I'm from Los Angeles originally, and I'm like, I used to go to Griffith Observatory and look at the craters of the moon
Oh,
um,
wow.
when I was a kid. And I that's not a memory that I've kept at the forefront of my mind. It's something that, in being queried on it, like, what are some memories from your childhood? I'm like, I used to look at the moon through fancy telescopes and stuff when I was a kid, and
Hmm.
would get all dreamy about it, like this alabaster landscape and everything that's out there and whatnot. So Griffith Observatory, if you live in Los Angeles, it's a great spot to visit the planetarium over there.
Absolutely.
And and just a lot of strange. So that there's the observation element, even like I wouldn't call it scientific, but it's starting to get closer to Virgo Moon ish ways of being Virgo Moon child. What I did find interesting, especially with the Virgo Moon thing, is so many of my earliest memories are memories of language that
Mm.
actually had to do with the moon. So, I mean, I looked at the moon and I would point at it as a little kid and this sort of thing. But like, for example, one half of my family is from Mexico, from Yucatan,
Mm.
Merida in particular. So the culture of the Mayas is Yucatec Maya in particular is part of my ancestry and part of my heritage in many respects. And my grandfather, every chance that he would get, would try to teach us a Yucatec Maya word every now and then. And
Oh, wonderful.
I have memories of him teaching us the word for full moon, which was Nohoch'uk, if I remember correctly.
Mm.
Um, and so I'm like, oh, my grandfather teaching me the Maya word for the full moon, as well as the other side of my family is from the Middle East, from Lebanon. And I was raised with Arabic actually as my first language on that side of my family.
Hmm.
And my first word ever that I ever spoke, word period, not just in Arabic, was baida, which means egg.
Mm.
And it's also close to the word for white, abyad. It comes from the same root. And I thought about it and I'm like, oh, it's kind of like the moon, weirdly. Like,
Hmm.
okay, egg, white things, that's my first word. And then I asked my mom about that same thing. She was like, your first Spanish word that you ever said was luna.
Uh,
And I'm like, okay, there's this weird theme of the way that language, right, we're talking about already, and its
hmm.
connection to the moon is already coming up for me with this whole Virgo moon thing.
Mm.
And so these are my first memories of the moon from when I was a little kid.
Mm. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, if we think about the moon as kind of like the initiator, and we think about Mercury as not only thinking, but I mean, there's a very lingual element with the moon as well. But if we think about Mercury as kind of like the childhood formation of language, it feels very kind of resonant or apropos in a way to have the first words be kind of like associated, have these lunar associations.
Totally right. And also like that's some Cancer rising shit right
Oh
there.
my God, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Amazing. Cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's
absolutely.
really, really cool. Yeah. And so today, what is your relationship with the moon, and why do you think it's important that we think or focus on the moon when we're talking about astrology or engaging in astrological practice?
The moon is almost everything in my
Mm.
current astrological practice, honestly.
Yeah.
It's and I've gotten much from Vedic astrology, and I have to give a shout out to the work of Victakara, who's
Hmm.
sort of like a rogue Vedic astrologer, if anything, not someone who is appreciated nor loved by the Vedic astrology establishment because he doesn't use sidereal zodiac, which
Okay.
is its own thing for its own time. We don't have
Hmm.
time to talk about that, but as a teacher, I would consider him like a teacher figure in my life. Just listening to his videos and taking a few of his classes, and I've learned so much from him and the understanding of the moon, as well as the Nakshatras or the Vedic Lunar Mansions, been so instrumental for my practice, for my life, for everything. So the moon saturates every part of my astrological practice and increasingly every part of my life. Some people follow transits more than others. I try to stay away from like overburdening myself with too many transits, at least in terms of my own life. But I follow the moon every day.
Yeah.
Following the lunar zodiac, these 27, 28 lunar mansions is a part of my daily practice. And that gets extended to my practice with clients, and all of the art that I've made around it. So the moon is most of what I do now, I would say. And I would include the stars in that the moon is helping me to connect to the stars. As we see in both astrology and astrological magic, the moon is that mediatrix, right, of the imaginal, of imagery, of rich imagery. And the moon gathers together, but the moon also disperses in light as well, which is one of the beautiful nuances of the moon, I think, in distinction to the sun, right, which is just radiating out and there's nobody else but the sun. It's just him up there doing his thing. With the moon, we look up and we can see the other stars, and you can see the community of others around the moon. So yeah, the moon is huge for me in every aspect. And I think in the Vedic astrology way, there's this emphasis on the moon is mind as well. And in a non-dualistic way, how the mind saturates everything.
Right.
And so I see the moon as mind, and I see it as body as well. For Cancer rising people, moon is especially body.
Right.
And so following those daily cycles is extra important. Yeah, I think that the moon is just I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the moon is everything that I do, almost 95%. I'm going to quantify it.
Yeah. And do you think that that's been your journey with the moon because of being a Cancer rising? Or what do you think, or because of it being kind of the mediatrix? Or I mean, what do you think has attracted you to it so much?
I want to say, and I'll talk more about this later when we talk about, I guess, the more personal placement of my moon. But the lunar mansion, or specifically in the Vedic context with the nakshatra, for my moon is very much related to the ancestors and to the dead. And this is something that has taken me a while to cultivate. It wasn't something that I necessarily felt from a young age, this connection to ancestry and heritage in that way. It came much later for me in that more Saturnine way of like it had to build and grow and age into quality with time. But I think more than anything, it was that ancestral connection, especially on the Arabic-speaking Muslim side of my family, which brought me to the Arabic lunar mansions. I guess I'll plug it since I'm talking about it, but I was a part of a translation project with Dr. Mina Enlows of the Shams al-Ma'arif, which is essentially the most popular grimoire book of magic in the Arabic-speaking Muslim world.
Oh, wow.
And people say all this stuff about the Picatrix or the Ghayat al-Hakim, but really it's the Shams al-Ma'arif through and through that people in that world, the non-Anglosphere, know about. And so we both, she was the primary translator, and I wrote an introduction as well as did much editing for it and illustrated it. And it was going through that process and learning just even before that how important the lunar mansions were for the Arabic tradition, as I dialed into my own ancestry and my ancestors' relationship to the stars, to the moon in particular. I think that was the thing that really set me forth on my path with the moon. This was around 5 or 6 years ago that it really got going in that way. So I would say it's the ancestral thing that really did it for me. And from that point on, it's just been learning more and more about the way those things exist even outside of my ancestry. So exploring outside of the Arabic tradition. So I've mentioned the Nakshatras and the Chinese lunar mansions and other things having to do with fixed stars. But it's that ancestral connection for me, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And is the lunar mansion the only kind of thing in your chart that speaks to that ancestral connection? Or do you have like strong fourth or eighth house placements or a strong Saturn? Like, are there other kind of testimonies to that?
Yeah, I have Saturn in the eighth house, which is another big, digging into the past, the ancestral heritage placement for sure.
Yeah.
If there's a planet that's explicitly dealing with the dead, it is Saturn.
Yep.
And the is there as well. And I also have Mars in the 12th house, which is like, going into the weird, not necessarily the past, but many of the liminal kinds of interstitial spaces of what that is. So yeah, all that stuff, it's definitely like, okay, this person was going to get into their ancestry, but not the conventional parts of my ancestry.
Yeah.
Like people could do that in so many ways, explore their ancestry. That's very vague. But for me, it was like, it's Saturn in Aquarius. It had to be like the strange starry realms of Aquarius that I had to go into.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. Yeah. It's interesting too to think about translating a book, helping to translate a book, because I do feel like the eighth house and Saturn being there, it's like the actual things that you inherit, rather than like I think of the fourth house as more of like the people, like the actual ancestors, and the eighth is like the things that you get from them, the other people's resources kind of thing. And it's just really interesting to kind of like the inheritance of knowledge and how that kind of plays out.
Definitely. And Saturn being all that weird, like abstract esoteric stuff too, like the faraway dim planet, right? The farthest dimmest planet. It's got to be all that weird stuff that gets inherited, all the Saturnine stuff, right?
Yeah. The occult knowledge and
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. All right. And so to get into the sign of Virgo, I'm curious what Virgo means to you. And if there's any like myth, be it Greek myth or just story in general, film, literature, what have you, that helps you understand that place, that environment, as well as how you kind of experience your moon there.
There's quite a few. When I was jotting down some notes, it's like hard to stop actually. It's a rich sign. I mean, I guess every sign is rich, and you could just do so many podcasts and whatnot on any given sign. But I guess when you have your moon in a place, it has that level of intimacy. Did you see there was a show that came out called I Am a Virgo recently? Did you see it? Okay, did you hear about it? Okay.
Maybe I heard of this. Maybe I did, but I don't think so.
It's on the Amazon Prime streaming service, which is its own. It's funny because there's all this like super anti-capitalist stuff in the show, but it's on the Amazon. Right. Anyways, you don't have to like think about it that much. But it's a silly show. It's funny. It's about this 13-foot tall African American kid growing up in Oakland, and just like what it is to stand out in that way. But he's secluded for a long period of time before he actually gets to get out into the city and the world and meet people. And I'm watching the show and I'm thinking about it, like what about this is Virgo like? What is stereotypical, but also where are the little nuggets of wisdom in it? And there's much to do in the show about what it is to be a hero, for one, which I find interesting. And a lot of people that I, not just moon, but Virgo sun people, Virgo placements in general. I mean, the helpful stereotype is always there, right? But there's this like superhero sort of quality to a lot of Virgo people that I know, if not like just an interest in for lack of a better term, that archetype, like what a superhero is, but also the other side of that, a villain, of course. But so, what is it to help a society, which is it's close to that. And Virgo is a sign very much like Libra and connected to Libra, related to fairness and justice in the world. There's many shades to that, of course, but I'm watching the show, and you have this giant kid who's 13 feet tall, and yet so much of the show, I'm trying not to give away too many spoilers, but I will say that so much of the show is about the small little things that we do that help our society, and how like getting to know those small, or once again, small, not in a bad way, but just like things that don't have all, subtle.
Subtlety feels very like a very Virgoan word, like
Absolutely.
knowing the intricate details.
Exactly. And how those intricate details or those subtleties are actually powerful and do make changes in the world. Even more than like the fact that someone is 13 feet tall and everybody sees him. And I don't know if that was the intention of the show, but I find this whole element of scale really interesting. And I think it's relevant to Virgo as a sign that also has a lot to do with measurement and counting as well. And I think even this emphasis on language that we've been sort of talking about gets into that, of like, words and letters as discrete things, as opposed to something, as opposed to something which is maybe more like a wash. So there is this element of Virgo of counting and particulars or details, as you said. I mean, for a variety of cultures, Virgo is related to grain. That's how we know it in the West more than anything else. And grain is, what is grain but little granules, right? Like particular bits. The Mexican side of me is like corn, of course. Corn is super Virgo. It's also related to the Pleiades. So it's not just Virgo, but it's prominent in the sense we're talking about little granules and seeds of potential. Virgo is also related to birth, to motherhood, and of course to virginity, which is its own weird thing with Virgo. And I can go
in
on
our society, absolutely.
The what that becomes in our society, it takes on strange connotations. But I went down a weird rabbit hole recently after reading an article on because another thing that gets associated with Virgo is the Eleusinian mysteries and all this stuff having to do with Demeter and Persephone, right?
Story very close to my heart.
It's an important one for me as well. I won't go through the whole story. I'd imagine most of the people listening are probably familiar with it.
I've told part of it on a past episode, like tearfully. So go back to the other Mercury Moon episode, the Gemini Moon episode I did with Shahir, if you want to hear more about that.
Okay, good. So I won't talk about it then, but there was an article that I read recently that took me down a little rabbit hole by this, I think she's an Italian scholar, Marguerite Rigoglioso, I think is how her name is pronounced. It's called When Spirit Possession is Sexual Encounter, which is a sort of a provocative title, I guess. But it talks about this notion of parthenogenesis, partheno being the word in Greek for virgin. So it means virgin birth.
Right.
And so she's talking about the cult of Demeter and Persephone being related to these much older parthenogenesis cults, where men, the male was not needed for the act of birth. And like many, there are reptiles, there's certain animals that are able to do this, where I'm not sure the biological details of it, but the egg doesn't need to be fertilized in the same way. And she's relating this myth cycle to parthenogenesis in this very serpentine way, and it just took me down this whole thing of like, virginity, like what is it to be born or to give birth without the other in this respect, solely from the individual self. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I'm not going to attempt to explain away that mystery, but I'd like to hold that mystery at the forefront of my mind when I think about Virgo. And, what is it to birth not just another being in a very literal sense of like giving birth, but artistic creations, right? A piece of writing, a piece of music. And in that way, I think Virgo is an immensely creative sign. I have a bias that I think it's immensely creative, and there's this parthenogenic element to it, that things may be born directly from oneself in miraculous kinds of ways. And I think similar, the virgin element touches on this notion of Mercury as the planetary lord of Virgo as psychopomp as well. And what is it about Mercury that allows them to be a psychopomp?
Right.
And I think it's this quality of being able to remain clean while going through, any given amount of worlds, whether that be the underworld, the middle world, the upper and celestial worlds. It is this almost skin shedding quality, as if a serpent, that allows Mercury and Virgoan people to be able to remain clean or virgin in a variety of sometimes extremely filthy situations. Which, in Mexico, the deity of corn, Centeoth, is born from Tlazolteotl, who is the filth eater, or the earth mother, the great goddess who is of the filth of the earth. And what do we get from the filth of the earth is the thing that nourishes us, the thing which is so clean that we can eat it, which feels so much akin to the mystery of Virgo.
Yeah.
Right? And that virginity is so much more than just like, oh well, she hasn't had sex yet, and this kind of really literal understanding of it.
Yeah. First off, before I forget, I just want to give a shout out to a past guest of this podcast, Lindsay Turner, because they're about to do a webinar. When this releases, they either have just done it or they're about to do it, about this idea of Virgo and parthenogenesis. So people should check that out. And they have a background in theology. They went to Union Theological Seminary, and so they are looking at it from a kind of more religious element, or a different kind of religious perspective. And so I just want to mention that. Another thing I want to mention, which you just reminded me of when I spoke about the Demeter and Persephone story on the past, the Gemini Moon episode, I kind of focused on Hecate. And it's interesting to think about, you speak about like the garbage mother, and it reminds me of ways that Hecate is typically engaged with, like kind of garbage and broken glass comes to mind. And there's an element of like thinking about, I have 8 nieces and nephews, and so I see the importance of family in raising children, and how often new parents will move closer to their family to have a kind of support. And there feels like a particular aid that can come with, like, if you associate like the grandmother as like the crone, like this older woman. And it reminds me of kind of the aid that Hecate gives Persephone in the underworld. And thinking about psychopomps is really interesting because, we have a few of these different kinds of examples of psychopomps, whether it be Mercury or Hecate or what have you. But yeah, I agree what you say about kind of Mercury in the underworld is very different than like the Inanna story, for example, with Venus retrograde, which we're kind of going through right now. Venus descending, it's a very painful experience for her. And that story is one of violence and betrayal. But often Mercury is descending to kind of relay messages. And so there's an interesting thing to think about with Mercury being the child of Zeus, of Jupiter, and having, in the Persephone story, for example, Mercury is kind of this go-between between Hades and Zeus. And so it's interesting to think about the relationship between Jupiter and Mercury as an access point for Mercury. So that's potential point of conversation. But the last thing I just wanted to say before I forget about parthenogenesis is it's really interesting. At parthenogenesis and virginity, at some point in my past, I was quite religious, and I heard several stories about virgin births happening in convents. And there's this kind of connection between I can't find any of this support anymore. I don't know where I heard the story, but the idea was basically that these individuals were intersex and basically self-fertilized. And there's a few accounts of this, of people kind of spontaneously getting impregnated in convents, but I can't find any of the stories anymore. But just the idea of virginity is very interesting, because if I'm not mistaken, when we think about or talk about the Vestal virgins, virginity had a very different context. And it was not that virginity was an absence of sex, but it was the kind of context or relationship to sex. And so the Vestal virgins were religious figures who would have this kind of like sacred sex with soldiers returning from war who were like kind of mentally scarred from battle, and they would caretake for these soldiers. But the virginity came in with, they were kind of tied to the religious order. They were not married. And so there was this kind of marriage versus virgin dichotomy, rather than like virgin versus like virgin as like has not had sex.
Definitely.
Which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about virginity. It's more of this kind of wild, untethered thing rather than a kind of purity.
Absolutely. And much of this article that I mentioned was more actually about what you're talking about. And I think it can sometimes be as simple as virginity being a gloss for someone who is not having sex with other humans, really, or if they are, it's based on these principles like you're talking about, but it's that could be that they are having these kinds of relationship with spiritual beings, which is the name of the article being when spirit possession is a sexual encounter, this kind of interpenetration that's happening with spirit. So it can very well be a gloss for that, as well as the impregnation by spiritual beings, right? Like we hear in so many of the old stories in the Bible and everything else of the fallen angels who came down and impregnated human women, all this stuff. They were virgins in this way, that they were not impregnated by human touch, was touch from something non-human, other angelic, however you want to put it. And I think Virgo people can weirdly do that more than other signs, perhaps. There is, and it is this like flirting with all the different dimensions that Mercury does, that if you want to give it a planetary angle, that has Virgo people doing this sort of thing. And in a similar fashion, I like that you brought up age, and older women or older people, and then going all the way to the young, quote unquote, maiden in this spectrum. And this spectrum is similar to the spectrum of the worlds, from the underworld to the upper and celestial worlds, right? And like in the Orisha tradition, Eshu, who would be related to Mercury, the trickster deity, the one who's found at the crossroads, he is oftentimes a young child just as much as he is the old man. And this is so much that quality of being able to embody the entirety of that spectrum, the gender spectrum as well. We, both of us, I know you do as well, refer to Mercury with they, them pronouns. And I think that's apt. That fluidity is there. And so I think it's a part of how that cleanliness remains intact, but not purity. As you said, it's not the same as purity. And I mean, that's just a whole loaded word in itself. Anyways.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we talked about like the precision, and I forget the other word that we used, that goes along with
the subtleties, the details.
Subtlety, yes. So we talked about subtlety and precision with Virgo, and you used the term like Virgo is not awash, but I think about the moon as this planet that's kind of awash, or is associated with the fluctuations. If we think of Cancer and we think of like what kind of water is Cancer, I think of it as like the tide pool or the part of the ocean where the waves are breaking and coming in, bringing things in with it or what have you. And like that, the kind of in and out of the tides feels very associated with the moon and the moon's cycles and whatnot. And so it's very interesting to think about the moon in this very kind of detailed, precise place. And I'm just curious if you could tell us some more about what that experience is like.
It's such an important point. And, as I'm talking about gradients and all these different sorts of things, it's like Virgo is the ability to hone in on any particular manifestation along that gradient. Not as much so good at maybe sensing the entirety of the gradient, but being able to see these manifestations along it. But and the moon being, I'd say, more of a planet that can sense the gradient or the gradient as the wash, and is maybe less interested in hyper focusing on particular forms along it. But what you said is oftentimes what gets brought up by, I've heard it brought up by multiple Vedic astrologers, talking about moon and Virgo, who are thought to mostly go pretty well together.
Yeah.
But it is this watery quality of the moon with the granular quality of Virgo that can be a little bit not necessarily jive all the time.
Yeah.
The particular in relationship to the wash, as you said. So, if anything is bound to go wrong, I think that's what it is. I guess can lead with that for Virgo moons. Like, you're sensing there's a bigger thing, but it's hard to not focus on any one particular thing there. There's a lot of anxiety that comes with feeling both of those things at the same time. To be the seed and to be the water watering the seed all at once is like, it feels like two separate processes at work.
Right.
And I think Virgo moon is kind of like that. Perhaps the secret there is to acknowledge that both of those things are necessary and to be able to hold both simultaneously and not see them as mutually exclusive, which can be hard, I think, for Virgo moon, which wants to see things as discrete objects, more or less. But then the moon's there and it's like, but there's more than just the discrete objects. And there is this ebb and flow that happens between seeing things in that way, but seeing that they're both essential parts of any given process of growth. To add to that, one of the things I wanted to say about Virgo is that as a part of the etymology of the term, it also relates to a kind of greening or a verdancy, viriditas, even like virile, or like the life force coming through, which is associated with the color green. Yet seasonally, it's in such a dry time, just like post summer, right? At least in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
Post summer, where things are getting sort of crispy. And I'm like, what? It's that whole Virgo thing again of like, okay, it's about life and it's generative in this way, but also it's kind of about death too. Persephone in this same fashion, like she's on top and then she goes down below and then she comes back up for a little bit and goes back down. And I think it's the same with the moon in Virgo, or really anything in Virgo, of like acknowledging that Virgo sees the upper world and the lower world, and how best to navigate that depending on what the planet is. So, if it's the moon, it's the water which flows from the rain down through the soil, trickles down into the roots of something, and that being a part of one process, as opposed to like, that's one thing happening over there, and then what happens below is a separate thing.
Yeah, it's all a means to growth, and growth takes both water and earth.
and death as well, and that
Yeah.
dry arid time
Mm,
where it's like, wait, how am I seeing
yes.
growth in this? You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how is the sign of the greening also the sign of moving into the underworld? It's both.
Yeah, very interesting. I feel like perhaps that's maybe the death of it is like associated with Capricorn in the winter, perhaps. Um, it's interesting to think about Virgo in relation to lunar phase as being a part of autumn, and if we think about the full moon as summer, and the preceding or the following phase as autumn, the nature of that is often described as cold and dry, which is the nature of Earth. And there's like this kind of um, rigidity to that. There's this kind of separation that occurs that I feel like happens with like the harvest moon, where things become particular in a way, so that exalted Mercury, Mercury exalts in Virgo. And I think about the kind of party that Mercury is having in its exaltation as like people getting together and separating the wheat from the chaff, separating the product that's saleable or consumable from that which needs to be put back into the
Mm-hmm.
pile to kind of die and give rebirth. Um, and so, yeah, it's just, I think it's really interesting to think about, Virgo as like um, mutable earth, but also to think about Virgo as like, not to get into the sidereal versus tropical, but I've heard that the tropical gained preference in certain traditions because of its association or its like fixity with the seasons, and the seasons giving this kind of temperamental description to them.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about them in these kinds of different ways, I think.
Similar to your question, and also what we were talking about with the third house, this process of separating the wheat from the chaff is a cutting process, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
something that cuts. It's which the moon with cutting things, they don't necessarily go together. It is that softer, like merging, kind of squishier quality of the
Mm-hmm.
moon, in a place that needs cutting. That I think that's similar, right, to discrete things as opposed to, or not as opposed, in contrast to, wetter, more together sorts of things.
Mm.
But yeah, Mercury has to cut to be able to do that. You have to like draw a line between it, and the moon isn't always. Moon is like, let's bring together as opposed to cut.
Right, right. Yeah, like let's wet the clay. And yeah, I feel like you can't have a sculpture. I feel like sculpture is a very Virgoan thing. I'm interested in your perspective as a sculptor and an artist, but um and you can't have a sculpture without wet earth, and but then it's like at some point the sculpture needs to dry and take form and gain a kind of permanence. And I don't know, that almost feels like the mercurial element to that.
Definitely. I think you can encapsulate so much of Virgo in what you just said.
Mm,
The whole process of making a sculpture from earth to letting it dry. In the same way that the harvest is that, it's the plants on the verge of, if not having already dried and ready to be taken up
mm-hmm.
and consumed, whether consumed by our eyes as a beautiful piece of art that we feast on with our senses in this way, or that we
Mm,
actually like nourish ourselves with, like people um, make jars and pots and things that we use in that sense, not just for aesthetic or decorative reasons, right?
mm-hmm.
So I love that as a, that's a good.
Yeah, and there feels like something is coming through about the moon in care and Virgo in service. And it's like the other choice, I think, which we've kind of spoken about in relation to death, is like, do we let what's dried on the vine fall onto the earth and decompose? And it reminds me of like the necessary choices of serving and the necessary choices of care, and how sometimes really hard decisions need to be made in relation to that.
Mm. It's, I mean, it's a farmer's sign. Not to get all like salt of the earth about it, but it's a sign which has so much to do with farming and agriculture. It's just what it is. And this whole like helpful stereotype of Virgo people, it's true in many respects. I see it with myself. I see it time and time again. Virgo Moon especially. But it's like, if you're not tending to the farm, if you're not tending to the garden in that way, like people gonna starve. It's like,
right. Come Capricorn season, we don't have anything to eat. Yeah.
Yeah, that work has to be done. And so I think for Virgo people, it's like, no, I have to do this for the maintenance of the universe, of the cosmos, and it's just like built in that way. Because for most of human history, people did not have that choice.
Right.
So just like Persephone was kidnapped against her will, I think that's an apt metaphor of like, Virgo also represents things that are not necessarily things that we make choices. It's necessities as well, right? Not to go into the whole like, what do you call it when the houses are lined up with the signs, and the sixth house being there's a whole name for that I'm forgetting. But
the natural zodiac.
Yeah, the natural order of the zodiac,
where you start with Aries and Aries becomes the first house. Yeah.
Yeah, for house one, and exactly. Yeah, not to go too much into that, but like I see that with the necessities borne out by the sixth house being similar to Virgo in that way, right? Like I can see that connection.
Yeah.
Like, no, we have to feed ourselves or we're going to die. So that's that critical element there.
Yeah, and very interestingly, the lot of necessity is Mercury's lot, taking the lot of fortune, chance, to Mercury and casting it from the ascendant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fortune feeling similar sometimes, in that respect. There's just like, what do we have? What are just the circumstances that we're given?
Right.
It's not the same thing. It's not as dire, but it's similar of just like the moon and Mercury. What do we have to do? And what do we have? What were we born with?
Yeah. Yeah. There can be positive associations with fortune for sure. Ananke and necessity often has more challenging significations, which I'm not an expert on, so I can't really get into that. I think our friend Ione, who was on the Desire panel with you, is going to do a lecture
on Ananke,
on Ananke at Astromedia, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Same.
Yeah, I'm really curious, with your Cancer rising and the moon being in joy, if you have any thoughts about what it means for planets to be in joy, as well as what we kind of touched on earlier with the thema mundi being a Cancer rising, and so the third house therefore necessarily being Virgo, and what does it mean for the moon to be in Virgo, with these kinds of associations of the moon joining in the third and Virgo being on the third in the thema mundi.
I'm not sold on the planetary joys schema.
Oh, interesting.
It's just one of those things that it kind of irks me a little bit.
Cool. This is the first time I've like heard someone express this, so I'm really interested.
It was like, I'm not super active on Twitter, and I haven't even been on there for that long, but one of my few, I guess, Astro Twitter rants was just a few things on the planetary joy schema. And it's I'm not sure if it goes any deeper than I think that this planet would probably be better in this house. Like, okay, in Vedic astrology, the moon does pretty good in the fourth, if it isn't like the best place for it to be, fourth house. That makes more sense to me than the third house, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Like, I'm not so sure Saturn in the 12th. Like, I know a good amount of people who have Saturn in the 12th. I'm going to quote Sasha, who we talked about, Sasha Ravich, on this, who told me once, like, just because Saturn is joining in the 12th doesn't mean that you are.
Yeah.
Which is a really great point, and also like brings it back to the planet as its own entity and spirit, and and character and personality of like, these things are nuanced in that way. I think Saturn's pretty good in the eighth, actually. I would
Mm.
say myself. I think Saturn is great in the eighth house. Um, but so certain ones like Mercury in the first, I don't know, like a warm, maybe a warmer planet in the first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I say I'm not sold, it doesn't mean that I reject it outright.
Right.
It just means like some of it just doesn't seem all that
Mm-hmm.
like there'd be better positions for the planets. As someone who has Moon in the third house, that's the one that I've thought about the most, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about this thing that I already brought up with the sibling rivalry, this kind of competitive and harsher side of the third house, emphasized more by Vedic astrology. I'm like, does the moon do well with that? Like, is that
Mm.
a good place to nourish the qualities of the moon?
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't have a final answer for any of this, but I would say that the things that I do resonate with are uh, these things we've also been discussing around speech,
Mm-hmm.
right? The language component, especially the roots of language, the formative elements of language, not this high mass thing that
Mm-hmm.
the ninth house does, but really getting down to etymologies, getting down to learning languages at grammatical levels, but going even further than that. I will give you an example of how I see this manifest in my life, this third
Mm-hmm.
house moon and Virgo thing. So, and it also talks about the lunar mansion, which I said is for me very much related to the ancestors and the dead. I taught a class called Moon Draws Upon Earth, where I got into the roots of the alphabet,
Mm.
going back to Egyptian hieroglyphs and then into the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, right around this level of the formation of the first alphabet as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
Not hieroglyphics, which would not be considered an alphabet
Okay.
by this definition, or like cuneiform or something like that. But I explored in this class, which this class is available to patrons of mine. I've made it available to the $7 patrons. Um, I explored the roots of the alphabet through the context of the lunar mansions,
Mm.
where I see it is my belief, and not only my belief. There have been scholars in the past who have talked about this, who I cited and mentioned in the talk, who see a connection between the shapes of constellations in the lunar mansions and the earliest alphabets.
Oh, wow.
I find this connection fascinating,
Yeah.
and I've done a lot of research on this, and this class was in many respects the furthest development of my work around this stuff and the way it relates to mysticism and the letter associations with the lunar mansions, which is something that comes out in various mystical literature with the Kabbalah and Sufism and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I see this as an example of a third house moon in Virgo doing its whole like ancestral digging down, not just to the grammatical roots of a particular language, but to attempt to see the roots of the form of the alphabet, but also how that relates to spoken language too.
Mm.
In
Yeah.
particular, the shapes of the mouth and how the shapes of the mouth mirror the shapes of the moon in
Mm.
type.
Mm.
The full moon being an ah, and the new moon, but also the full moon being a closed mouth, that
Mm.
and how these open letters or liquid letters also relate to the lunar phases. So to me, that class is like, yo, third house, Virgo moon shit
Yeah.
right here. Like, let's connect these things, language and the moon together.
Mm.
I think that's the best example I can give of when those things, at least in my life, are working together cohesively and intellectually, and I can pull from all these different dimensions.
Mm.
But yeah, I think the third house is still is it's all those roots, and it's skills, it's tangible skills in that way. I don't know if I have any thoughts on the thema mundi. It definitely, for Cancer rising people, it gives you a little bit of an ego boost. Um, It's like, oh, Thema Mundi, Cancer rising,
Yeah.
like yeah. um
Someone the other day was like, "Oh, your ascendant's on like the cosmic center." I have a Sagittarius rising, and someone was like, "Your ascendant's like the cosmic center of the universe," and I was like, "Yeah, no big deal." I get that in my own ways too.
oh, I love it.
Yeah. One thing I want to say about the third house moon,
Sure.
that feels really interesting is I was reminded of, if we associate the ninth house with like higher education and the third house with more kind of basic or primary education, it's like what's more primary education than the alphabet? And like I was reminded of being a 4 or 5 year old and like drilling the alphabet and just really hating it. And I'm a notoriously bad speller, which is just really interesting just to think about. Like, I've been in grad school, like I think I'm a relatively intelligent person, but there's like just some of the basic foundational stuff I actually really did not enjoy in terms of education.
Mm.
But it's also interesting to think about, like, you kind of compared um, the ninth house language to the third house language. And it reminds me that, like, you can conjugate verbs all day. Like you can do the ninth house stuff with language, but language, having learned a foreign language or a second language, I learned Spanish at the age of like 27. There's like no amount of that will prepare you to actually know the language if you don't have conversations with people, and it feels very third house and very lunar thing, like this kind of really coming together and having conversations to really know something and to know a language in particular.
So well said. So like ninth house people be like, I'm going to learn the Latin mass. Like
Uh-huh.
this, this sort of thing. And third house people are like I was just in Istanbul recently, and everyone came up to me and was speaking Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Lebanese. It's like I sort of look the part as well, or like people who are like generally from this part of the world. Um, but yeah, it's like that element that you're describing of picking up on all of these little linguistic cues, whether it's in intonation, cadence, pronunciation too is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And just that on the ground language learning that you're talking about, conversations with other people and the differences and in region and land and how that factors into language, like, and once again, even like the way you look and body language and these things and how that also gets, that's a part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
All that is third house language stuff for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. For some reason, I think because maybe I'm back home in New York where I grew up, I'm reminded of this, and I like love The Sopranos, and I'm reminded of this article that I read where they like basically analyzed the kind of North Jersey, New York Italian dialect that came over from southern Italy and Sicily, and how things are said in very particular ways. And it kind of just analyzed that kind of Italian dialect, which feels very just reminded me of that. Italy in particular, I don't have an Italian background. I studied Italian in high school, but Italy in particular is a place where language is hyper local. You like cross a bridge to another village and they're speaking in like a different dialect. So it's a fascinating read and kind of puts a lot of, because even, growing up Irish American, these kinds of words, particular ways of speaking, pronouncing foods in particular, fall into the kind of lexicon here in New York. So yeah, it's just fascinating stuff.
Definitely. It is.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to, before we move on, just want to ask if there's anything else that you want to say about, I guess we'll go with the lunar mansions first. If you want to talk about like the importance of people kind of knowing their lunar mansion in their natal chart, how lunar mansions can play in other forms of astrology, whether it be electional or what have you. And just curious as well if there's like any other third house significations that you want to bring up.
Like I mentioned earlier, the moon being so much of what I do, if not like most of what I do now. I would say that that is the moon in the context of the lunar zodiac, which is another way of referring to the lunar mansions. I've been using stations more than mansions.
I like that.
It is increasingly, it's made more and more sense over time. In the same way, like the progression of time and the movement of the moon, it's less static. We use mansion, or lodge is another way that it gets referred to. We use that with domicile, right? We use domicile in astrology all the time. House, domicile, we use these terms a lot. But there is a static quality to that I don't think jives so well with the moon, especially the way I see the moon as the traveler. So much a part of my work is in the like backpacking with the moon through the stars, or getting possessed by the moon, if you will. Sexually Possessed by the Moon by J.M. Hamade. That's the next.
A memoir.
Yeah. Is just so much a part of my practice, and there's movement with traveling. So in the same way that the lunar stations are referred to in the Arabic traditions as these locations along the Silk Road, primarily where travelers would stop. Merchants, which is another both mercurial and lunar association, right? That with merchants, where merchants mostly, but travelers would stop and they would rest for the evening. And while they were resting, they'd happen to look up at the moon, because they weren't looking at all the shit that we look at nowadays. Instead of looking at the sky, they would look up at the moon and they would see some stars next to the moon, and that was the lunar mansion, or that was the lunar station.
Right.
So the station mirrored that stop that they were making on their journey, right? And every stop on their journey had a certain quality to it. This is referred to sometimes as the caravanserai. Of a caravan. And so this is how I see the moon, and this is how I see the lunar zodiac, and this is deeply embedded in the Arabic tradition in particular. So once again, this has informed the earliest parts of my practice. But the lunar zodiac is the movement of the moon through these 27 in Vedic astrology. There's a hidden one of the pole star, or of Vega, the old pole star, which would be 28, but 27, and then 28 for the Chinese and the Arabic signs, just like the 12 sign solar zodiac that we're all familiar with. So calculating where the moon is for any given natal chart is one part. I can speak a little bit later about that position that I've already mentioned, which is very ancestral for me in my chart. But looking at the natal position, which is its own thing. And then, of course, there's the whole tradition, which gets into the magical aspects of it, of seeing what is good to do on certain lunar days, right? Like, don't cut your hair on this day. Don't propose to somebody on this day. Don't go visit someone in a position of authority on this day, et cetera, et cetera. And then the ways to zhuzh that with magic, with the moon. But the lunar mansions, or the lunar stations, they're basically a zodiac unto themselves, with just a different division of space of that 360-degree circle. More and more, I appreciate that. And maybe this is more of a third house thing. Just looking up at the moon and seeing the stars that it's near to, that like original way of seeing the lunar mansion. We have mathematical divisions now, which, depending on the tradition you use, will vary. I have my own variant of that, but I enjoy just looking up the moon and being like, oh, the moon is next to Castor and Pollux. Like, the moon is in the 7th lunar mansion, Aldira, Punarvasu, and speaking to the moon and stars in that respect. So it forms its own zodiac, which my work has been reading charts mostly in that way. I think we are now living in a time, for better or worse, where there are so many incredibly well-trained astrologers who are using the solar zodiac. And though I will reference it, of course, and have been trained in that same system, I feel like it's important for me, as someone who the lunar zodiac is their main thing to really, in client work and in my own life, focus on the way the moon manifests in these different places. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more like breakdown of the lunar mansions or stations. I like the idea of a station because of there feels like a bit more mobility with that. Like mansions and houses don't necessarily like move.
Exactly.
But stations I feel like I don't know, that feels like it can move a little bit. And the thing with the fixed star, or the thing with the stars, is that there's precession, so they kind of move. So ostensibly the lunar mansions move slightly as well over time, correct?
Which is its own, it's a complicated subject, and probably I teach a bunch of classes on the lunar mansions, and this is the thing that gets asked more than anything. Unlike the solar zodiac, the lunar zodiac is still tied to the stars in a way that the sun is just not.
Right.
And that is very literally because you can see the stars when looking at the moon, and you can't when you look at the sun. I mean, that's one thing. But the tropical zodiac in particular has just become something unto itself, right? People relate it to the seasons, but we're not really referring to, those like three very dim little stars that make up the stars of Aries when we're thinking about the sign of Aries for the most part. That has become its own separate thing. Not so much with the lunar zodiac. It is a little bit more so in the way that people practice the Arabic tradition, especially in the paradigm of the Picatrix, where they continue to use the tropical zodiac. And so they are not precessing coordinates, meaning there isn't this slippage that you're referring to that comes with precession. The other most common way that you see, which is how nakshatras get used more often than not, is through the sidereal zodiac. But it's wholly the sidereal zodiac. So the entirety of the zodiac is already being precessed with a particular ayanamsha, or a point of beginning. That is fixed to particular stars, as is the particular nakshatras. It's like this nakshatra begins at this part of Aries, and because the whole zodiac is being precessed, you always know, as long as you're sticking with the sidereal zodiac and that whole precessional cycle, where the nakshatra is going to be. I have come to, and there's a few people who use this. Victor, who I mentioned, is someone who uses this, which is, I think he was the initial impetus for me to begin to take it up. And it only has made more and more sense for me since then. I do think that some of the earlier Arabic astrologers were also using the sidereal coordinates for the lunar mansions, and that tradition hasn't always exclusively been a tropical zodiac. But essentially what I do now is I use precessed sidereal coordinates with a tropical zodiac. And the thing that I use as an example, because once again, this is the most common question that I get in almost every class that I teach, is the way that we look for the coordinates of fixed stars in Western astrology with the tropical zodiac. We know that the example I always use is Algol. It's at roughly 26 Taurus. So with precession, that degree changes. It's going to move. It's going to continue to move ahead, because with precession you have a roughly 1 degree change every 72 years, give or take. So I'm essentially doing that with the lunar mansions, where you are just factoring in precession. So those coordinates get updated once every 20 years is a good time to update it. If you have a planet which is right on the edge of a lunar station, then you might be like, okay, I need to get more precise with this. But oftentimes, unlike I think the solar zodiac, you can kind of get a feel for if someone has, let's say, the moon in one station versus the next one, like if it's on the border. I think it tends to be fairly obvious in the person's character. But
interesting.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that because of the star that each station is related to, that star has its own mythological associations, lore, images, forms of magic, plant associations, all of these different things. So the the ways that lunar stations are interpreted are through in the same way that the solar zodiacal signs have these same qualities are through these different qualities, which more often than not come from the stars that they're related to.
Okay. Very interesting. All right. I think to move on a little bit, can you tell us about Mercury and their placement in your chart and how that affects kind of the manifestation of Virgo or your experience of your moon?
Well, in a really quick off the bat, I have Mercury in the 10th house in Aries. So it's like I'm going to be talking about all this third house stuff with the moon and everything of my chart in a public.
You're going to be doing this podcast.
Yeah. So that's one way to interpret that, as well as having a podcast and talking about a lot of this sort of stuff myself, or teaching classes on it, and all of this. So it can be that literal sometimes. I Aries 10th house, the 10th house is kind of an unstable place. It's up in the sky. It's not like the fourth, that earthy, grounded, rooted place of depth. It's high up in the sky, and it's very windy up there. So Mercury as a airy and movement based planet, quick planet, is going a little crazy up there sometimes, catching an inspiration and then letting it go just as quickly as it found it. And being an Aries, it doesn't help that same sense of impatience, right? Or like immediate inspiration and then loss of said inspiration. Or sometimes you can catch a spark and cultivate it and blow on it a little bit and ends up, becoming a great big fire, but hopefully not too large a fire, right? But yeah, Mercury in Aries in the 10th house, it's like podcasting, it's just speaking in a public manner in general, so speaking to larger amounts of people, outside of my particular circle. That quick inspiration, momentary inspiration. Also, one of the more cutting Mercuries, right? Like a Mars ruled Mercury, especially having Mars in the 12th house. It's like even like unconsciously cutting at times around things, more cutting than I realize around certain things. Yeah, I would say that the squishy hard, or the squishy sharp combination is interesting for me. I get a lot of artistic fodder out of that. Having a Mars ruled Mercury with the moon down in the third house in Virgo. That combination. My moon also has Antisha with Mercury.
Oh, interesting.
So they're connected in a variety of ways.
How do you see the Antisha kind of playing out?
I think they've learned to get along with one another. I think they've learned that it's better to work together, like we've been talking about, than to fight against one another. And I think in acknowledging that, I've gotten better at it myself, and I've gotten better at seeing it out in the world as well, and in my relationships and all things. So I think there's an increasing level of harmony between them. Also, and it's also very like a 10th to 3rd thing of like, and moon to Mercury in the 10th, of the way that private things or things that shouldn't be spoken about or secret things interact with speaking about so much of that publicly, and all of the weird nuances that come with doing stuff like that, speaking on occult matters and having initiations around certain things that aren't necessarily meant for the masses. And being able to ride that line better and better. I think those things play into one another. My moon has a good trine with Venus and Taurus. That's my art aspect. I think, for sure, especially with what would be called the plastic arts. Sculpting, right? Painting, all those things have always come very, very naturally to me. Two earth signs, Virgo, Venus in her home sign in Taurus. All that stuff is just working alongside one another and being able to, I think, bring in more of those sensual elements from the Venus and Taurus into a lot of the mercurial stuff that I do. Trying to have it be grounded in more sensual qualities. And I think a good podcast can do that. I don't know if I always succeed at that, but
yeah.
I think your podcast does that a lot.
Oh yeah, you think so?
Yeah, I think Moon, I do. Yeah, Moon people are better at that. It's that intimacy, right? But yeah, so I'm learning about more and more of that as well.
Well, thank you for that. I try my best.
And you succeed.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think that there's something interesting too about, not to kind of get off topic, but the Moon Mars mutual reception that you have with I'm sorry, not Moon Mars, the Mars Mercury with Mars in Gemini and Mercury in Aries. And so there's an interesting kind of 12th, 10th house relationship, which I feel like also you kind of speak to with this idea of like shedding light on things that are occult or things that are hidden, and it feels very like 12th, 10th.
It definitely defines me. I think that those two planets and the way they're relating to one another, as well as that out of sect malefic in the 12th house, it's just like Mercury is like, let's talk about it with Mars. And if you talk about it, if you talk about all these weird fringe things, you talk about it, you write about it, you do these mercurial things. It's sort of a way of exorcising the demons of Mars in the 12th house, because there are some real demons with that placement. No doubt about it. So yeah, it's like kind of this public ongoing exorcism for all of you. So you're all welcome to witness that. But yeah, I would say if anything is my thing, that's my thing. The relationship right between Mercury and Mars in that context.
Yeah, again, not to go off topic, but I do feel like Mars placements, I feel like for me, I resonate with this idea of like where you need to kind of exercise demons. And I have Moon Mars in my first pretty closely conjunct. And it's like, I've been thinking about this more recently of like needing to move every single day, or I just like feel off. And so there's something about like this kind of sacredness around movement and this balance that comes with like moving in particular ways. So it's interesting to hear that kind of plays out for you with the Mars Mercury.
Yeah, and it's like it just saturates everything. All this stuff I've been talking about, the traveler.
Yeah.
Like you would be a shoo-in for the lunar stations. Like no wonder the station resonates with you. It's like it's on the go. Your moon is on the go in that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the relationship of your moon and your sun. So your sun is also in Aries, correct? So what does that, how does that like, how does the lunar phase play out or manifest in your life?
I feel like that approaching the full moon phase, waxing gibbous, it's a pretty anxiety prone placement. I've heard that from other people. Once again, moon in a Mercury ruled sign, it's like a lot of just mental, and I have Mars in Gemini as well. There's just like mental anxiety stuff with that. And it's like constantly bubbling over in some sense. Luckily for me, it's mostly with like things I want to do and dreams and ambitions, not with like, some of the more negative, the extremely negative things that can come with anxiety. But yeah, like so many things I want to do, so many things I want to try. Maya Rourke once described it to me in a reading as like the fire hose in the face kind of thing of like just like give it all to me in that respect. So yeah, I have a bunch of those placements, and I see the moon on the way to becoming full as a part of that, of like it's a cauldron about to bubble over. And so it's like take a little out and know what plant to water, with that little bit of excess, what is dry, what needs to be watered, and then, once that space has been made, like what to refill it with is just a never ending thing. Um, I mean, progressed moon stuff. I just passed my full moon in my progressed chart, and I feel like, okay, so I'm beginning to learn a little bit more about what it is, at least since I started studying astrology, what it is to like be in more of the waning phase of things and not think about things in the context of that approaching fullness of that brightness. Um, so I think that's maybe a welcome addition.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's sort of an anxious placement. Linguistically, so I think mentally, but not always in a bad way.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about, like, spoken before about this like quote from Hamade that the sun always receives the moon. The moon is always reflecting the light of the sun, even if it's like averse. It's interesting to think about what reception means in terms of aspects. But depending on lunar phase, you think about lunar phase, you think about the sign that the moon is in, and then you think about the sign that the sun is in and what kind of light, like what's the quality of light that's being reflected. And I think with the exaltation of the sun in Aries, you spoke about, it feels very fitting, this idea of like the fire hose, like give me it all. And the sun being your sect light too, it's like very much the sun held up in the 10th house, like this kind of highest part of the sky. And so it does feel like the moon has to reflect this light that is like very kind of intense and large and has this big energy to it. And it has to do it in this way that's, yeah, a very different manner. It has to filter it through this prism that is very different.
It feels like, for me at least, contradictions up and down sometimes. It's like the Cancer rising thing is so, it's this weird, soft, sharp thing that's always at play. And it's like being a Cancer rising person, if even with a day chart, it's almost like the moon is your sect light in some sense too. Honorary sect light or something like that.
Right.
But is also being lord of the first house. It's like the moon as your body and that intensity of heat. It's like when I get those inspirations or I feel the thing or whatever, it's like I feel that heat being generated in my body and I start to sweat and I start to get red, and it's like, woo, the moon is responding in exactly that way you're describing, of like I feel it viscerally. Absolutely.
Yeah, it feels like those stories of like the genius or the daemon descending, and you're like, I gotta get this idea on paper right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It comes out in what feels like that whole sexual possession thing. It's gonna that's giving me ideas.
Yeah. I'm very excited to see where you go with that. Feels interesting. All right. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about lunar mansions and the moon?
I have a ton to say about the lunar mansions. Yeah, I almost don't know where to begin with the lunar mansions because it just saturates like every aspect of what I'm doing and my being at this point in my life. Like I said, it's a daily practice. Um, I encourage people, if they don't know what lunar mansion that their moon is in, that they go check that out just to begin with. And that's I think even in talking about like good entryways to working with the moon or doing lunar things, it's like, well, look at your lunar mansion.
Yeah.
And you can look at that. There's differences, right? Like we talked about, between your sidereal or purely sidereal lunar mansion as well as your tropical lunar mansion. You can feel out the differences, and if you're like, astrologer, and you really want to nail the coordinates down, like which one feels more like you.
Yeah.
So, I was convinced of the sidereal one, but, suss that out for yourself. That's a good way to feel into your own moon, as well as in beginning to explore lunar mansion magic. But yeah, check that out if you haven't. Um, and there's so many different ways that you can look into that. So I encourage all people to, if they're interested in the moon at all and you haven't explored the lunar mansions, then get on that.
Awesome. Yeah, do you have any other suggestions for folks that are new to astrology or planetary relationship and forming a relationship with the moon?
Another thing that it's part of my daily practice in this way, that other astrologers have talked about. Claire Nocti, who does a lot of this like media analysis stuff with Nakshatras, has talked about it. She's like a very well-known YouTuber, talking about Nakshatras, but really in her own way. It's not like all super traditional or whatever, but she does this kind of media analysis thing with it, where she sees how people's natal moon, ascendant, and sun placements mostly manifest in the roles that they take on as like actors and artists and things like that.
Oh, cool.
That's
fun.
Which is cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so Chris Rapucci and Elodie St. Ange Aubit of the Lunar Zodiac Project have talked a lot about the way that the lunar mansions manifest in our dreams as well. Which is something that is another way that we can track the movement of the moon, as well as see it in our natal chart or other people's natal charts, and see how the moon as mind manifests at every level of culture, and in all the worlds, right? In the dream world. And you can analyze other people's dreams in this capacity, or like, where was the moon when you had this dream? As well as in media and I mean film and television. This is such a lunar thing, right? The projection of the thing is this kind of lunar projection thing that's happening of the dream, right? Of the created dream.
Yeah.
So of course it takes on these lunar qualities of like shaping the Maya. So I think for someone who wants to get into lunar stuff, as well as just an observation of mine that I think is really cool, is like start looking into that element of it. See where either the placement of the moon in the solar zodiac, so like the moon in Virgo in this instance, or the placement of the moon in the lunar zodiac. See how that manifests in all these different ways, whether it be media, whether it be your dreams, things having to do with your body, so on and so forth. I think that's when you can see the astrology at every level in that way. That's like when you're living, breathing, eating, sleeping, shitting it. If you've got south node placement, strong south node placement, shitting astrology,
essential part of life. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. Any imparting thoughts on the moon before we wrap up?
Go and look at it.
Yeah.
Her, she, they, them. Yeah, go look at the moon. I've spent almost a decade studying astrology now, and I'm still finding myself going back to just looking up at the moon and the stars. Not to kind of end on a cliche, but I don't know. I've lived in cities most of my life, and there's something that you just can't recreate with any amount of software or technical knowledge. That just looking up at the moon and maybe having a conversation, even just observation. There's no replacement for that. So yeah, lunar mansions, looking at the moon, as well as seeing how the moon comes up in all these different facets of life.
Absolutely. All right, Jay, where can we find you? And is there anything you're working on right now that you'd like to share with us?
I have a few projects brewing, which I'm very excited about. Some things I'm not going to officially announce yet, but some exciting things brewing pertaining to the lunar mansions that go far beyond much of the work that I've already been doing with them. I taught a class recently for the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival, focusing on the lunar mansions and the lunar mansions that deal with serpents and Ophidian beings and dragons and this kind of thing. And that class is available to buy until the end of the year.
Okay.
I think we are doing more with this panel on desire, and hopefully doing more of these kinds of panels with Sasha and others. I'm mostly just secretly working in the dark around a lot of things, but my website is starnightdwell.com, and you can find me at starnightdwell on everything else: Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. There's also the podcast, which is A Star Night Dwell. A is a separate word, Star Night its own word, and then Dwell its own word. But you can access that from my website. And if you are interested in what I'm working on and what is to come, as well as ways to support the podcast, to look at some of the other articles that I've wrote, some of the artwork that I make, all of that can be found on the Patreon. So I encourage those who are interested in my work, as well as the podcast and all the rest, to check out the Patreon, at least give it a peruse. And that's another great place to find me.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link all that in the show notes. And thank you, Jay, so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and hope we can do it again soon.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.